Hey guys, this is Adam, and today I want to show you how to build dynamic pipelines in Azure Data Factory by determining a list of objects and files that you want to process during the runtime. This is Introduction to Azure Data Factory, Lookup and ForEach Actions. Stay tuned. Let me say a few words about Lookup and ForEach Action before we move to Azure Portal. First of all, the key concepts. Lookup action allows you to retrieve a dataset. It can be either from a file or table within your database. And you use that dataset to determine the list of objects that you want to work for the rest of your pipeline. And it pretty much supports most of the data sources that are currently supported in the Data Factory. So you can use pretty much any kind of database or flat file solutions. And additionally, you pair lookup action usually with ForEach action, because lookup returns a list of objects, but ForEach actually allows you to execute a set of activities for each object on that list. And this is the scenario that we're going to be working on today. So the part of the demo is today like this. First of all, we're going to be listing tables from SQL database using a lookup activity. Next, we're going to iterate over the results returned from the SQL server. And for each table within the iteration, we're going to do a simple copy extraction. So we're going to extract data from SQL database into a CSV file on a storage account. So the demo for today is going to be done in step-by-step fashion. So I'm going to have this slide where I'm going to be jumping between presentation and Azure Portal, and I'm going to be doing step-by-step setup. So first, let's go to Azure Portal where I'm going to explain our initial setup. For the initial setup, I created 3 services in Azure. I created a data factory, I created storage account, and I created SQL server, and I have one database on that SQL server. Those are the 3 services we're going to be using today, and let me explain each one of them. First of all, data factory is the main piece of work we're going to be doing, but we're going to move there in just a second. First of all, let's go to storage account. On the storage account, I have empty storage account. There's nothing done here yet, except one container called exported data. This container is currently empty, but this is where we're gonna be uploading all our exported files. So we can close that for now. And additionally, we have SQL database. I'm gonna very quickly use Azure Portal to log in into that SQL database because it's currently empty to set up some initial data for us to work on. So I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna use Query Editor. So I'm gonna quickly log in into SQL right now. And inside here, you can notice we have currently no tables. And I prepared a script for you to execute, which creates a very simple tables. So as you see, it executed. We have 3 tables, 428 rows, 17 rows, and 112 rows. If we're gonna refresh the view, we're gonna see that we have cars table. We can actually select top 1000 rows of it. And as you see, this is some basic car information. You can select 1000 rows from countries and do the same with 1000 rows from the movies dataset. And we're gonna use a dynamic approach to extract all those 3 tables without us typing, hard coding the name of the tables anywhere. We're just gonna dynamically grab all the tables from this SQL. And that's it when it comes to initial setup. So right now we can actually go to Data Factory. I have it already opened in a next tab. And in here, we're gonna do a couple of things. So let's see what steps we need to perform. First of all, we need to list tables with a lookup action. And to do that, we're gonna need to set up a couple of things. First of all, to start working, we need to connect to SQL Server. So we need to set up a Sql Linked Service. Let's go to Azure Portal and do that. So let's go to Connections, create new connection, select Azure tab, and you can either type or scroll down to find Azure SQL Database and select it from Azure subscription. I'm gonna select my ADF Lookup Demo database, select the database name ADF Lookup Demo, use admin username and a password. Test the connectivity to ensure everything is working fine and hit create. So the first step is now done. So let's see what's next. Next, we need to set up a dataset that we're gonna use to list tables. So before we move to setting up the dataset, we need to be sure that we know what kind of data this dataset will be returning. So let's go back again to the query editor, where I'm going to use a simple query, because you can actually use this query where you input your database name, grab the information schema and tables to list all the tables within that database. Just remember to replace this database name with the name of your database. This will return something like that. So as you see, we have 3 tables: cars, countries, and movies in this database. So I'm going to use this query to grab the data from the data factory. So inside of the data factory, I can now go and create the dataset. So I'm going to hit new dataset, again Azure tab, scroll down to Azure SQL, select the link service that I just created for the database, and I'm going to call it table list dataset. Right now, I'm going to leave table name as empty because I want to use dynamic query for it. So I'm just going to hit OK. And now what I need to do is actually nothing else, because I will be able to use this using dynamic query later on inside of the lookup action. So let's go back to our steps and see what else do we need to perform. So the next thing we need to do is add this lookup activity and the pipeline itself. To do that, we need to first create a pipeline. This is currently an empty pipeline, and find ourselves a lookup. As you see, it's not in the move and transform, it's inside of the general. There's a lookup action here, just drag and drop it. And right now, list tables. Let's rename it to be very clear what we're trying to do here. And inside of the settings tab, you can select the data source. In here, just select your table list. And instead of leaving this as checkbox as table, change it to query. And right now you can input that query that you just prepared. So we're gonna use this query to return a list of tables dynamically. And to confirm this works, you can hit on a preview data. And as you see, something interesting just happened. It returned only 1 row. And this is because there's a first row only checkbox here. But let me very briefly explain how does it work. So lookup can return either a list or a first row only of that data. And depending what you're gonna choose, you're gonna get a different response. So it's quite critical to understand the difference. If you're gonna select true in that value, so check that checkbox, you're gonna get an object with one property called first row, and then your item, your row of data will be within that property. And once it's there, you can access this by using an expression calling activity function, grabbing the output property, and then first row property. This will return your item. On the other hand, if you uncheck this box, you're gonna get an object with 2 properties: a count containing number of rows returned from your data source, and a value containing an array which has all the rows from your data source. And accessing it is fairly simple because you either use output.count or output.value to get a count and a value respectively. So the 2 limitations that I would want you to know about here is, first of all, there's a maximum of 2 megabytes that you can return from your data source, and also maximum of 5,000 rows. So you cannot do super huge pipelines based on the metadata. In case you do, you will need to break it down into multiple pipelines. But that's the story for another day. So let's go back to our example and let's set this lookup activity. So inside of the lookup activity, if we uncheck this box, you can again press preview data to see the list of all the tables within your database. As you see, as expected, we have 3 rows of data. So what do we need to do next? Next, we need to add an iteration. An iteration will allow us to go through each table within this result set. And to do that, simply scroll down to the activities called iteration and conditionals, and grab and drag and drop ForEach. And in order to ensure that ForEach runs after the lookup, just drag this line here to make sure that the pipeline is ordered properly. And that's pretty much it. So before we move to the next steps, let's talk about for a minute how does the ForEach actually works. And as I mentioned previously, with ForEach you can iterate over the list of objects from previous steps. And to do that, in case we grab this lookup activity, we grab the value, that means from this object we grab only the array with 3 items. So let's do that in our case, and let's go Azure portal, and in here inside of the settings you need to set up the items property because these only require property for the ForEach. And in here you can actually parameterize, so use and add dynamic content here. And if you scroll down, you're gonna find activity outputs list tables. And notice that it actually mostly gave you the expression that we were talking about. So activity function from the previous step, which is called list tables, grabbing the output. So the only part we need to add is dot value, since our array and our list will be within this value. So let's hit finish. And we could probably test it right now, but let's talk about for a minute more how does the ForEach works. So since we now initialize the ForEach and it's gonna iterate over it, you can now use an expression, and this expression is called item. It's a function which will return the current iteration item. So for iteration 1, this will be item 1, for 2, 2, for 3, 3. And we're gonna use this in a dynamic dataset to perform our copy activity. And one thing to note here is that you cannot nest ForEach inside of a ForEach. So you cannot do nested looping. If you need that kind of behavior, then you need to nest a pipeline and then put a nested ForEach within that pipeline. It's a bit cumbersome, but it's how it is. It is also worth noting that when you use the item function, you can actually access properties. So if that would be example of our data, we would have ID and a table name for our array. That means you can use item.tablename to access the table name property of those objects, in which case for iteration 2, that would return countries. And this way you can actually iterate over each table and then prepare a custom expression, custom behavior for each two tables and do the copy activities. All right, so the next thing that we need to do, let's go to the diagram. The next thing we need to do right now is to copy the table from the SQL to the blob storage. Since we already have the Sql Linked Service, the next thing we need to do is Blob Linked Service. So let's go back to Azure Portal, let's go to Connections, hit New Connection, select Azure Blob Storage, hit Continue, select from our Azure subscription, select the storage account name that we're using, in this case it's ADF Lookup Demo Storage, hit Test Connectivity to always ensure you're connecting correctly, hit Create. Alright, since we have it done, what's next? Next we're gonna need to set up two datasets. We need to set up dataset for the input, so for our SQL table, and for our blob file. I know you could potentially reuse the list tables dataset that we created, but I'm not a big fan of it. I think it makes a mess and you're gonna sooner or later break something apart. So just keep generic approach and create separate dataset for SQL and separate for generic table. All right, so let's create those two datasets. First of all, we need a dataset for SQL. Again, go to Azure, select Azure SQL, select the link service that we just created, and I'm gonna call it generic table, or maybe just SQL table. It's gonna be using my Azure SQL Database 1 connectivity, and in here, I'm gonna leave table now for none because I want to program it generically. So I'm gonna hit OK, and first thing, since this is generic programming and its table name gonna be different for each iteration, we need to introduce a parameter. This will be called table name. And we need to use that table name inside of the connection here. In the table, instead of the dropdown, hit edit and hit here the table name. So add the dynamic property and hit the table name. To be honest, SQL also have schemas. So to be fully compliant, very well programmed in this case, you should also add a schema name. And use that schema again in the connection here. So add the dynamic content and select schema name. Because you can actually have the same name of the table across multiple schemas. If that would happen, then your pipeline will break. So let's make sure that doesn't happen. All right, now we of course need the same dataset that will represent our table, but on a blob storage as a file. So we need to hit new dataset, select blob storage, select CSV format because this is the one we're gonna be exporting to, and I'm gonna call it CSV table. In this case, I'm gonna selecting my Azure Blob Storage connectivity, and I need to select path. So I need to hit browse, which will allow me to select a container. In this case, it's exported data, hit OK. And then we need to provide the file name. But what I'm gonna do is, first of all, I'm gonna select first row as header, just because I always want my headers in my CSV files. I'm gonna select import schema as none, because this is the output dataset. Output datasets don't need to import schema. And for now, I'm gonna leave file name as empty, because I want to parameterize it as well. Okay, so in here, I want to provide a file name parameter. And this parameter will again be used in a connection tab in a file property. So just hit dynamic content, select parameters file name, hit finish. And now we have fully parameterized datasets. So the next thing we need to perform is the very last step. So we need to add a copy activity within this ForEach and use those datasets in there. So let's go to Azure portal. And to do that, we go now to the pipeline. And since we have that ForEach here, you just hit this edit. And inside here, drag and drop into the panel the copy data. Notice that on the top it says what's the pipeline name, that was the ForEach name. Of course, for brevity, change the name of the ForEach. In which case, in our pipeline, that would be, let's go to the top, ForEach should be called ForEach table, right? And then inside of it, for each table, what do we want to do? Export table. Here you need to select a data source. So our data source is our SQL table. And notice that in here, it did actually recognize that you have table name and schema name that you need to provide. And to do that, we need to use dynamic content. And as I said, you need to use expression. And I showed you that you can use function called item. If you scroll down, you're actually gonna find that for each iterator is here because it did recognize that you're using expressions within a loop. So you can actually hit it and it will say item. Right now you are ready to use the expression here. So just type dot and the name. And the name of the property will be the same as the name of the SQL query returns. So you're gonna have table underscore schema and table underscore name. So for the table name, we just grab table underscore name, hit finish. And for the schema name, it's pretty much the same. Just scroll down, select ForEach dot table schema and hit finish. That's pretty much it. Now for the output, go to the sink, select the dataset, in which case it's CSV table. And again, you need to provide the file name. So in this case, I'm gonna use a dynamic content. And again, I'm gonna use the current iteration name. But I want to be sure that my files will not be overridden in case I have multiple tables with the same name. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna concatenate. So I'm just gonna grab this, cut it out for a second, concat. And I'm gonna concatenate item.table schema with underscore sign, and then I'm gonna add item.table underscore name, and lastly I'm gonna add a CSV at the very end. So in our case, a cars table should be called dbo cars CSV, pretty much as here, dbo underscore cars.csv. So let's hit finish, and that's pretty much it. If we didn't make any mistakes, we can actually go back to the pipeline and hit debug before we actually publish it to ensure that everything is working correctly. So let's wait for a minute. The pipeline succeeded. We can notice a couple of things. First of all, there's a list tables action here. You can actually click on it, but if you go to the bottom here, notice that there are those input and output, so you can actually review what did it return. So in case of list tables, what did it return? Notice this, count 3, because we have 3 tables, values, and as you see, table catalog, table schema, table name, and table type, which corresponds to what you were returning using our SQL. And as you see, we have all those 3 tables and some extra information. And we use this as an input for each table. For each table doesn't show input, but it shows the output. And the output is that the count that it iterated over was 3. And you can actually see 3 executions of the export table. So let's go back to Azure Portal. Let's go to the panel. Let's go to the storage account, container, exported data. And as you see, fairly easy. We have our cars table exported. We can actually review the contents. And as you see, those are cars. Those are the countries. Everything worked perfectly, and with just a couple of minutes we were able to parameterize all of that. One thing additionally that I want to show you is how to change this pipeline to only select few tables instead of all of them without you hard coding this. One approach that I like to do it is to use a metadata within the database. So let's delete those files for a second. Alright, so we have a fresh start. Let's go back to the SQL. Let me log in very quickly in the editor. And in our SQL, I'm going to create a simple table called exported tables containing 2 major columns, table schema and table name, to represent pretty much the same as we were just using right now. And in this table, I'm going to insert 2 rows called DBO cars and DBO movies, containing a list of tables that I want to export. So I'm just going to run it. And inside of tables, you can find a new table, and we can return the first 1000 rows. So our expectation is that using this query, we should be able to export only 2 tables. If you actually maintain the table underscore schema and table underscore name as the names, you can actually just grab this query and replace this one, because our nested actions are still using the same table schema and table name properties, so we don't have to change anything else at all. So let's just run debug to ensure that everything is working correctly. And the run just finished. As you see, the list tables returned only 2. That was expected. And you see there are only 2 export tables actions within this ForEach. So you can also go back to your Blob storage to review the contents to ensure everything was exported correctly. And as you see, we have only 2 files here, and this is how easily you can actually use metadata-based approach in your metadata tables to export dynamically your tables, or maybe import dynamically your tables. It's pretty much up to you to design your workflow within this ForEach loop and using lookup actions. There are plenty more scenarios that you can achieve by leveraging functionality of the lookup and ForEach, but it's up to you to design those generic workflows yourself, either exporting, importing data. Both can be done using this functionality. But that's it for today. If you liked the video, hit thumbs up, leave a comment and subscribe if you want to see more, and definitely see you next time.